What's up, guys? Welcome to ZCT or Zygrene Car Talk number 36, joined by Kevin. Zypoppy Talk, yes. Joined by Kevin from the Jubbal and Cars YouTube channel.
What's up, guys?
I think it's been 6 months since I did the last episode. That was with yourself and Chris, aka
Was that
the
all
Topher.
things GR and BRZ?
Yeah, the episode that sort of got some interesting feedback, both positive and negative. Obviously, things have moved on quite a bit since then. I've sold my BRZ.
We do need to talk about our GR86 BRZ stuff at some point during this conversation.
That is going to be a topic for sure.
All right.
But for this episode, we're going to focus on just wrapping up the 2023 year for both of us with our respective YouTube channels. Obviously, if you guys are new here and you haven't seen either of our channels, both Kevin and I have an unnatural affinity for driving dynamics.
Walking encyclopedia. Hey, Fenton, 2002 Honda Civic.
Hit me.
What's the horsepower and torque?
160 horsepower. Oh, Honda Civic or Honda Civic SI? I'm talking SI numbers here.
Ooh. Okay, I guess that makes sense because you know like the sporty.
Yeah.
2013 Scion FRS horsepower torque.
Easy. 197 horsepower. Ooh, 151 torque, I think.
I think let's see.
Anyways, so we're going to focus on just a number of different categories, and we're going to go top 3 cars that come to mind for each category. And it's going to be an interesting variety of categories. It's not all going to be like what's the best cars we've driven and whatnot, but there's going to be some interesting quirky categories thrown in there. And I know that both of our channels, you know, more recent months or maybe the last year or so, we've been doing a lot more newer cars, like press cars, things that are just hot off the press. But I think it's accurate to say that both of our channels still, for the most part, are focused on driving viewer-owned cars. So a lot of older stuff, a lot of quirkier cars from the last 10, 20, sometimes 30 years.
A lot of cars on my list are actually from that in various categories. But I think we should also mention that you have your ZPI, Zygrene Performance Index,
yes,
Zypoppy Performance Index, and I have JCDI, Jubbal and Cars Driving Index, and those are both on Google spreadsheets, and they're below the link. You know, they're in the description, link below. And I think some of the categories are probably going to be based heavily on the scoring rubric that we have there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the scoring, I go back and forth on that because it's so hard to assign, you know, quantitative scores for cars. I mean, obviously both of our scores are focused on driving dynamics as a whole, but when you're comparing something like a 30-year-old Mazda RX-7 versus a brand new GT4 RS, it's so hard to keep the numbers and scores relative because there's such different experiences. So for the first category here, which is best driving, I didn't just go down my list and pick the top 3 cars that I drove in the last year.
I did
more,
but it's also because I added a new column called emotionality, which allows me to then give bonus points to the car that is overwhelming my senses and with excitement, even though technically speaking, it may not be as balanced from a handling or etc. Perspective versus something else that's ranked higher. So,
and I have something similar to that in ZPI called the wow factor. But I think the problem with my scoring system is that the wow factor can only have a maximum of 5 points, and my total score goes up to 65. So it's a small percentage. So a lot of times the older cars that don't, 4.42 points to be exact. But let's get into it. So the first topic or first category here is best driving. So how about you go first? You give me your top 3 and just a quick 1 or 2 sentence summary on why for each one.
All right. So this is just the top 3 on my JCDI. Number 1, 718 GT4 RS. Number 2, Ariel Atom 4. Number 3, 458 Italia. So I also have honorable mentions, which I actually put, I think this is number 5 on my list. Yeah, number 5, which is the 991.2 GT3. Even though it's not as proficient as number 4, which is the 718 Boxer Spider, which was track prepped by a viewer. That thing drove amazing. The GT3 was manual, and that was part of the fun for me versus the 718, which was auto PDK. And that pendulous booty with the rear engine, just it's another element of fun. Imperfection is actually more enjoyable in certain ways, or at least some of the time. So the 718 Cayman GT4 RS is close to perfection, I would say, in terms of the way that it drives. It's so sharp. So like you take that and you compare it to even a regular GT4, like that versus a regular GT4 is the same gap from a regular GT4 to like an S. You know, it's a huge gap. It's very surprising. As much as I loved it, I do also want to say that it's too loud. I literally had tinnitus ringing in my ears for 2 weeks after that. It was just, it's over 100 decibels.
You do have more, like your ears are more sensitive than the average person's though. So just for reference, for those of you who have never been in a GT4 RS, I would say it, because I daily drove that car for 4 or 5 days, and at some points it did bother me, but it never left a sort of ringing like discomfort or anything like that. But it is an incredibly loud car from inside.
Too loud in my opinion. So the Atom 4, I would say, because it's just so unusual. Actually, we're going to talk about the Atom 4 in the later on in this video, because I do want to talk about my future car purchases. But that was just so raw, so visceral, so go-kart, so unlike anything else I've driven on the street, that it was probably the most memorable driving experience this year. And even though it's powered by a Civic Type R engine, the sounds that are like right there in your right ear, because the intake, little snorkel, also sounded great too. And then number 3 would be the 458 Italia, which drove very well. One thing that you also need to keep in mind is like we're making relatively subjective assessments of these vehicles. We're trying to be as objective as possible, but we're humans and we have like different kinds of days. So for whatever reason, that day I was driving the 458, my mood wasn't maybe in the same place. Like it was a very memorable experience, but it wasn't, maybe my expectations were too high actually. Maybe that was the thing. It was a great car, but the GT4 RS and Atom 4 were much more memorable, much more impactful to me to drive.
Interesting. Okay. I almost had, so if I went by like the top 3 scores in ZPI, I probably would have ended up with the same 3 cars, to be honest. Actually, same 4 if you include the 991.2, which is hilarious. But I instead chose a kind of different approach where I chose one in the upper echelon of the price range, at least for the cars that I drove this year. So that being the GT4 RS, it has current market value, last I checked, of somewhere in the $200,000 to $250,000 range. And so out of all the cars I drove this year, that was the most dynamically proficient, at canyon speeds, not on track. So super sharp front end, super precise steering, engine response that is just out of this world, like so sensitive. The throttle response is insane. The PDK is the quickest, most precise, most drama-free transmission in any car I've ever driven.
And the PDK got even better. Just when you thought it was already perfect, you're like, oh my God, this thing is...
It's almost too perfect. Like the shifts are almost imperceptible when you're going fast. It's actually very clunky at low speed. It almost feels like you're slipping a clutch, because essentially it is. But there's a level of perfection to that car that's borderline
clinical,
boring. Yeah, too clinical. Yes, but that's kind of a
German way. Yeah.
Either way, like that is dynamically the best car probably that I drove this year, at that price point and overall. If you go down to the more pedestrian levels of affordability, still kind of out of reach for a lot of folks, but in these, let's say, sub $50,000 price range, I'm actually going with the E46 M3 that I drove. I know you didn't get to drive that. You couldn't make it down to the Bay that weekend, but I drove my buddy Chris's mint 06 E46. It had MCS coilovers, like an aftermarket intake, and that was pretty much it, and like an exhaust. And that thing was just everything I love about driving. Front engine, rear wheel drive, high revving, naturally aspirated engine, enough power, but not too much power. I think it dynoed at like three something to the wheels, 350 maybe, in say a 3,300, 3,400 pound car. Loves to rotate on throttle, super easy, to control oversteer. Good hydraulic steering. I mean, basically everything you'd want in a driving experience. And coming away from that driving experience, I think that at some point I need to own one for myself.
Oh wow,
Probably
that's
as a
impactful.
track car.
Yeah, wow.
I think when I have the space and money to afford a dedicated track car, there's a reasonably good chance that I'll be looking for an E46 M3.
And not an S2000.
And yeah, not because one is better or worse. They're both really great. They have a lot of similarities and some differences, but just because I've owned, so many S2000s, kind of ready to try something different.
That's fair. Yeah, you do get bored of cars a little bit faster than I do. Because the S2000 and the E46 M3 are the two vehicles you told me to consider as a replacement for my GR86, because I want something that is a dedicated tractaway. So I'm looking forward to hopefully being able to drive a similarly tuned E46 someday.
Hell, even a stock one is great. And then the third car I chose was actually a car that I reviewed on track. It's a car that you and I both reviewed on the street, but it was borderline undrivable. It was the track prepped full aero Supra, Mark V GR Supra, with the 8-speed ZF auto. It was way too stiff. The spring rate was completely inappropriate for any sort of bumpy canyon road. Way too much grip, stock power, not even a tune, just some bolt-ons. But when I drove that car on track at Sonoma, it just made perfect sense. It was not perfect. I think the suspension still needed some dialing in. It felt a little bit unsettled over bumps. Granted, Sonoma is a very bumpy track, and they are going to be repaving it, I think, this year, I want to say, or maybe next year. But it was so incredibly fast and capable. It was the first time I had ever gone sub 1 minute 50 seconds at Sonoma. And just the outright grip, the power. I was looking at my best lap of the day. I forget the exact time. It was like a 149 or something. But the Vmax on the straights for a car with stock power was shocking. Like, it's rated at 382 horsepower, right? And the speeds I was hitting, like 130 plus on a track that doesn't really have that long of a straightaway, I was shocked. So I really got into a groove with that car, and I can understand why it's such a popular track platform, especially for people who have owned S2000s in the past. It's kind of a logical progression from that platform, in my opinion. So
interesting. Speak more to that, the progression from S2000.
Well, I think if you like a car that's very front engine rear drive in terms of the dynamics, and it's challenging to drive at the limit because it can be snappy. I know a lot of people don't like that, but if you're someone who likes to be on the edge at all times, both the S2000 and the GR Supra will give you that. And there's not really all that much you can do in terms of setup to make it tame. Like an E46 M3 to me is a much easier car to drive at and past the limit compared to something like an S2000 or GR Supra, for various reasons, which I can go into in way too detailed of a fashion for this video. But they both are imperfect in their own way, but that imperfection is what makes them so fun at the limit and dangerous. Both cars I've seen crashed at many track days. So, so yeah, that's the best three driving cars for each of us. The next topic is going to be more subjective, and I suspect we're going to have slightly different answers for this one. Best sounding cars.
All right, you go first on this one.
Okay, I'll go first in no particular order. GT4 RS, again, is going to be on that list. It is just the most intoxicating, aggressive, violent, purposeful, precise, all the superlatives you want to throw at it, engine sound. And I specifically mean from inside the car. I actually don't know what the car sounds like from outside. I couldn't care less. It could be dead silent from outside. It could sound like a Tesla Model 3. I don't care. because this car has the most unique in-cabin induction note of any car I have ever driven, including like all sorts of modified aftermarket cars with various intakes and whatnot. The sound of that, you know, carbon snorkel right behind your head, it almost sounds. I read this in an article by Jethro Bovingdon recently, but it sounds like there's a microphone hooked up to the engine and you're just wearing headphones. It picks up every little nuance of the engine, like the little whirs, the clicks. It's not just the, you know, the engine sound that you would expect to hear from an exotic like sports car, but it's every little nuanced detail. And that's what makes it so intoxicating. Obviously, it revs out to 9,000 RPM. Sounds glorious from outside as well, I'm sure, but it's really that induction note that blew me away.
Yeah, what's very unique about that experience is the driver sound or passenger sound, just inside the cabin versus outside. Mine was also, that also made my top 3 list. I will also preface by saying that sound to me, a lot of people obsess over a car sound. It's not as critical to me. I of course appreciate it and it's part of the emotionality. But I mean, dude, I drove a FRS for 9 years. It's not the number one thing for me, but that also made the list for me. GT4RS.
FRS.
I just wish I could tone down the volume a little bit. I would have to wear like musicians' earplugs, like the same things that I would wear at a concert. I'd have to wear those if I'm at track. Actually, at any given track day, I do wear earplugs anyways because sometimes it can get very loud depending on what car is you're passing or is passing you.
Right.
But man, I was stressing for those 2 weeks where my ears were ringing. Like, dude, what is going on?
Yeah, honestly, those earplugs that you can wear at like music festivals, that might be the right call because you still get the sound. It just reduces.
It doesn't alter the actual fidelity. It just essentially turns down the volume because everything it lowers the decibels evenly across the whole frequency response. Not just like normal foam tips are going to really have that muffled sound because the high end gets just plummets. Right.
So another car that I thought sounded great, which a lot of people disagree with. Actually, it's a video I just published today. The Ferrari 458 Italia. A lot of reviewers, a lot of commenters I've seen over the years complain that the 458's engine, which is a 4.5 liter flat plane crank V8, naturally aspirated, they say it has a much too monotone or flat sounding I guess characteristic, which I agree. Like you start that thing up, you let it idle, it doesn't have any sort of that lumpy, cammy sound of like an American, V8 from like a Mustang or a Camaro, even compared to something like the GT350 with a flat plane crank engine or the new C8 Z06. It has a much more sort of flat pitch to it throughout the rev range from idle all the way to 9,000 RPM. And it does make it sound less aggressive in some way, but I appreciate just the sheer purity of that sound because it's so clean. Like it just feels like that sound was produced in, I don't know, like an airtight laboratory. Like that's the best way I can describe it. And no other engine sounds like that to me.
I haven't come across the reviews that spoke about the 458 having issues with its sound. I always thought that, I mean, a lot of the C8 benchmarking was against the 458, and when they were talking about the flat plane crank V8, again, they were comparing it to Ferraris. I don't know. I think that they were specifically mentioning the 458. Maybe it was some other Ferraris as well, but that's surprising because and yes, that also made my list too. The 458, especially my top 3 best sounding are the same as the top 3 best driving.
Got it. Yeah. So like Chris Harris doesn't like the sound of the 458. He said it on camera multiple times. A number of commenters as well say like the older Ferraris sound better, which if you like a really aggressive, like loud in your face sound, the 458 is not that unless you throw some crazy exhaust on it. But again, it's just that cleanliness that I appreciate.
Purity.
Yeah. Another car I chose, actually I have one honorable mention, but naturally the 718 Spider,
Ooh,
top down
really
with an Inconel aftermarket exhaust, absolutely insane. Just the fact that you can hear the exhaust. So that car is more about, for me, it's more about the exhaust versus the induction sound. Like the GT4RS, pure induction note. Spider, you get some induction note as well, obviously with the engine being right behind you, but the exhaust with the top down, it's just sheer aggression. It's a different kind of aggression than the GT4 RS, even though the engine being a naturally aspirated flat six, it has a similar character. It's just a different tone and a different way to enjoy the sound of that engine for me.
That's a great one. I love the Atom 4 too, because it was just so, I mean, talking about hearing everything from the engine, it's literally right there exposed with you. And the turbo whooshes and
dude, I mean, every time you lift off the gas, you just go deaf.
Yeah, I was wearing earplugs. And even just the turbo, like all the sounds were just so intoxicating to me. I loved everything about that experience. It was so cool. If I could justify one, I would totally buy an Atom 4.
Yeah.
I think the Boxer Spider was, with the top down, an amazing experience. Definitely an honorable mention for me. And also the R8 V10 Plus Spider that I drove in 2018.
Ooh, yeah.
Also very, I mean, it's a V10. Need I say more?
Yeah, that is a great sounding car. The closest thing I drove to that was several years back, 7 or 8 years ago. I drove a Huracan, and it's a very aggressive sounding engine, amazing sound. But I don't know, I just prefer the sound of Ferraris over Lambos for some reason. Even V8 Ferraris, even though V10 Lambos with that engine, just it's more aggressive, it's louder, it's more in your face. It's almost too in your face, in my opinion. But we can get into that another time. Hopefully we can drive some more Lambos this coming year. Honorable mention for me, 1990 Mazda FCRX7 with a rotary engine revving out to 8,000, I think a little over 8,000. Eric's car that we both drove, I think twice this year. Amazing sounding car, not much power, 160 horsepower, maybe a little bit more. But the sound of the rotary engine, it's like a swarm of angry bees.
I think it's a great description for it. Yeah. I think that drove phenomenally. Eric knows what he's doing when it comes to setting up cars. It wasn't as memorable in a positive way, the sound for me. The engine smoothness was very memorable. Just the way it drives was very memorable. But the sound, to me, I was like, okay, this is cool and very smooth and very rotary, but wasn't as emotional and musical to me.
That's fair. Yeah, I just love that angry bee sound. Plus, when you lift off the throttle at higher PM, it does a little sort of backfire. Just absolutely, just so good. Okay, next category here, most surprising in a good way. We'll have another one that talks about, in a bad way, but most surprisingly good car to drive, meaning like you went into that review thinking, oh, this is going to be whatever, or even maybe, hey, this is going to be pretty good. But when you drove it, it blew you away even more than what your expectation was.
I got a lot of cars in this section.
I'll let you go first here.
2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, I got 5.
Choose your top 3 first.
Number 1, 1998 Acura Integra Type R DC2.
Oh,
because the owner has done an immaculate job restoring and just setting up this car. He spent a lot of money on it, and it shows. The reason it was so surprising to me is that there's kind of a circle jerk about Honda and Acura front-wheel drive performance cars. And I've driven a lot of the recent variants, FK8, FL5, and they just don't do it really for me. And I've talked about that a lot on my channel. I think that they are technically very proficient for front-wheel drive. Kind of like saying the tallest little person, you know what I mean? Because there are certain things that you're just always going to miss out on. Or so I thought. And then I drove this at Button Willow, and holy crap, man. Just the way that this car came alive when you are in the braking zone and it's wiggling around and you're getting a little bit of rotation, and just everything about the experience was ticking all the boxes. It was fun. It was playful in a way that I've never seen any other front-wheel drive vehicle. The action of the manual transmission, the sounds, like how light it was, everything came together in a way that made me appreciate front-wheel drive in a whole new way that I'd never done before.
Yeah, I remember you called me actually after that track day, and you were just like, I think driving back, and you were just giggling the whole time. I was like, dude, what's going on? And you're like, yeah, I drove an Acura Integra Type R. And
It was a big
yeah,
deal.
I mean,
Yeah.
I've only driven a stock one in the canyons. This was several years back, but someday I would love to try one on track. There, even to this day, a lot of people claim that the Integra Type, the DC2R, is still the best driver's front wheel drive car of all time, and I have no reason to think otherwise.
Yeah, even the steering on front wheel drive cars is very hard to get because those are the wheels that you're sending the power to. But even the steering was great. It was such a special experience.
I'm sure. On that note, just because you mentioned a front wheel drive car, I'm going to give my front wheel drive car pick for this category. Most surprising for me, 2013 Mini Cooper John Cooper Works GP, also known as the GP1, I think. I don't think it's GP1 or GP2, I forget. But the 2013 model turbocharged four-cylinder engine. I went into that review, honestly, having very low expectations. I've driven a Mini Cooper before. It was just a regular Cooper S, and I've never thought much about it. It's a fun little car. It's notoriously unreliable. You see them and you're just like, oh, it's a fun little toy car. It's not really that rare or really that special. But when I drove that car, I was blown away. It was, at one point, I literally thought this might give the DC2 Type R a run for its money for most fun to drive front wheel drive car I've ever driven. And that's considering it had an open differential.
Wow. Really?
Which is crazy. And I did feel the limitations of that coming out of corners. There was some one tire fire, but just the sheer lightness of that car, the way you can just brake super late and deep into corners, the rotation off throttle, just everything about the steering feel, it was incredible. It's a car that frankly sucks when you drive it slow. The shifter is kind of vague. There's, it's very bumpy, harsh, a lot of NVH, but it really comes alive on a canyon road. And that was definitely one of the most surprising cars I drove.
How much does it weigh?
I think it's in the range of 2,600, 2,500 pounds.
That's very light.
Yeah. All right, your turn.
The other funny thing about that Type R was that I was instructing at Buttonwillow, and the student that I got assigned to just happened to be, the owner of the Type R, which was just such a crazy
super cool guy.
coincidence.
Yeah, I know him. He I've driven his what was it? I drove his 991.2 GT3 Touring a few years back.
Awesome. Yeah, really cool
great
guy.
taste in cars.
Next one for me. This is gonna come out of left field. Suzuki Jimny. Such a fun little car. Looking at it, I was like, okay, I'm gonna review this because it's unique and I want to try different things. But there was something about there's this X factor. If you look at it from a purely driving proficiency perspective, no, you're not going to be impressed by it. But the way that it has this joyous nature to it, that this playful energy with all the inputs, with the way it drives, the weight transfer, the way it looks, the styling, the way the interior designed, I loved it. It was memorable, and I would never own one because safety and size and practicality. I think part of the reason why it's not sold in the US, I think, is because of safety issues. I might be mistaken. Let me know in the comments if so. But very memorable. Very memorable.
Yeah, I would have loved to drive that too. It's just one of those, it just looks like such a carefree kind of car. Like you just hop in it just for good times.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'll go next, I guess. This one was very surprisingly good. BMW M240i xDrive. So you look at it on paper, heavy all-wheel drive, 2 Series, center of gravity is probably pretty high. It's not an M2, it's a fake M car, so to speak. How could it possibly be good? Automatic transmission. But then I drove it and I was like, this literally feels like a slightly heavier, larger GR Supra. That's all-wheel drive.
I'm surprised. I mean, you have been hating on the styling of these cars since the debut.
I hate how it looks. It looks just like so. I don't want to say this on camera. It's just not a good looking car.
I don't think it's that bad.
But something about, I think, okay, it has a B58 engine. So when you realize that, it gives you an inkling that there might be something good to its driving dynamics. But that engine paired with a ZF 8-speed transmission, same essentially engine and trans that you get in the GR Supra, and an all-wheel drive system that is rear drive based. So it's not like your typical Haldex or symmetrical all-wheel drive system in a Subaru or whatnot that's going to understeer into oblivion. Yeah, it still had a playfulness to it. Even though it was a little bit heavier, it had lazier responses, it's still a car that felt adjustable based on what you did with your inputs. And that combined with the fact that it's actually reasonably comfortable and spacious as a daily, it's a car that I thought, maybe 5-6 years ago, I would have been down to own one. Now that I'm a little bit more, I guess, nuanced in choosing what I want in a car, it wouldn't tick all the boxes for me, but nevertheless, I have completely changed my stance on, I respect that car a lot more than I used to.
I drove the M3 Comp on track, also X-Drive. And I was also, pretty similar conclusions. I'm sure that they drive more similar than different in certain ways, but rear wheel based all-wheel drive system was playful, let me control the yaw, but still wasn't difficult to drive. So playful, super fast, super capable. It was just too heavy. That was the main critique I had.
It's not a car I would take on track, the M240i X-Drive or any sort of X-Drive BMW. But yeah, I agree. I think it's a good fun daily. That's how I would sum it up.
All right, next for me is going to be I did this video comparing the Lotus Emira Touring versus the Sport chassis versus an Evora, and I wasn't able to drive it on proper roads. It was like a city road that at the end I had a little bit of twist, but it wasn't too much, and a little roundabout. But the Sport versus Touring chassis for the Emira is much greater than I expected. And I think the Sport is plenty comfortable, plenty compliant, and is far more responsive. So it really solidified. I already ordered mine with Sport suspension, Sport chassis. It really solidified that that's by far my preference. And I think for most people, it would be their preference as well, unless they really don't, they're not into the whole driving dynamics. But if they follow our channels, it probably are to some extent. Yeah. But then I got into the Evora and I was like, dude, this interior is way crappier. The styling is not as good. But I literally drove it for not even 5 minutes. In those 5 minutes, I was like, this car feels more special, more old school, more like an occasion to drive, because the Emira now is just so refined and so nice and so polished. The steering on that Evora was a little bit more alive. The way that the engine sounded was a little bit louder. It's interesting. I'm really looking forward to doing a proper comparison of Emira Sport, which I'm supposed to be getting in January. Let's see if there's any delays, versus Evora and many other comparisons. But I'm very, very interested in doing a proper comparison on a canyon track, on a canyon road.
If you're able to ever bring the Emira down to the Bay Area, there's a number of Evora GTs I could potentially get access to for us to do a comparison. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah,
on some proper roads too. And I've never driven an Emira, so that would be super interesting for me as well.
For sure.
Okay, so last car for me, for most surprising, Corvette C8 Z51. It's the first and only C8 generation Corvette I've ever driven. We both drove that earlier this year. I think very early this year in some of the LA canyons. And
we drove it again on track at Road America.
You did. I didn't. I missed out on that opportunity. I ended up driving some other stuff. Would have loved to have done that. I should have prioritized that, to be honest. But in the canyons, I was like, okay, C8 Corvette. I imagine it's going to feel just kind of like a mid-engine C7 Corvette. Lots of torque, lots of power, straight line speed, good brakes, probably numb in the corners, numb everywhere else. and it was not. That was not the case. The mid-engine. I think my overall conclusion was that the C7 truly did reach the limits of what a front-engine rear-wheel drive Corvette was capable of dynamically. Because I drove the big daddy, the granddaddy of C7s, which was the ZR1. Actually, I had the car for a few days as a daily, and then I also drove it in the canyons as well as on track, and I just wasn't impressed under any circumstances. It felt big, it felt heavy, it felt like the front didn't really want to turn that much, despite it having massive tires, super numb steering, clunky manual transmission. But then I drove that C8 with the dual clutch, the 8-speed. The mid-engine balance was phenomenal. The steering, while still pretty numb and lifeless, it was a lot more precise than the C7. The 8-speed dual clutch, super quick, not that far off from a PDK, still a little ways off, but very, very good overall. And it really felt like the Corvette had truly evolved from sort of that archaic, kind of old-fashioned driving experience into something completely different. And I'm very excited about the future of Corvette. The E-Ray's out, the Z06 is out. Would love to drive those at some point, but even just the base Stingray Z51 was phenomenal.
Yeah, it drove very well. I was, based on the reviews, I was expecting it to drive very well, and it didn't disappoint at all. They probably could have extracted more from the FR platform with the C7. I mean, if they stuck with the FR platform, not having leaf springs in the rear, as an example, things like that. Mm-hmm. But I'm not super strongly. Some people are like, "Yay, mid-engine." Some people are like, "This is no longer a Corvette." I don't really care.
Yeah.
Next for me is going to be the 997 GT2 versus the GT3, and because the GT2 is much rarer, much more expensive, more powerful, I assumed that it would be the car that is going to be my preference. More special, more fun. But driving both of them on the same exact roads, granted a few months apart, the GT3 being naturally aspirated, the sound and the immediacy of throttle response, and being able to not having any turbo lag mid-corner when you're trying to modulate yaw and such, very much speaks to my preferences. And the 997 GT2, amazing car, but and the straight line speed was, I mean, that was straight giggle city there, but the sound and the not as linear throttle response made me realize that it's not as aligned for my preferences. So that was definitely surprising.
Yep. One
more was the Subaru WRX, and the one that we both drove in LA a couple months ago.
The 2022, right?
Yeah, I guess I had low expectations because we drove a previous gen WRX that was modified, and that one did not drive well on the canyons. But this almost stock, it wasn't quite stock. The owner actually did some very intelligent modifications that improved the handling, improved the front end sharpness of the car.
Stiffener. Yeah, the draw stiffener.
And the way that I was like, dude, what in the world is going on? This car drives way better than I expected. So that was a pleasant surprise. The styling is very polarizing, but the car drives a lot better than it should. And I do have one more thing, but we'll do that later in the video.
Okay, sounds good. All right, let's speed this up just a tad because we have 4 more categories to go, and then I know we have a couple other topics. So next category is most disappointing or overhyped. Pretty self-explanatory. A car you went in, with a certain expectation, and then you left with, wow, that was not as good as I thought it would be.
BMW M2 F87. Oh, sorry.
Oh, the base M2, right?
The base. I didn't drive any of the other ones that you drove.
6-speed manual. Yep.
So
I actually would agree with that. Yeah.
That was a dream car for me when I was younger. When it first came out, I was like, all these M3s are getting larger. The M2 is now closer to what I dreamed about when I was a kid, loving M3s. So like the E36, E46. So when I finally got to drive it, I was like, this is not nearly as engaging, not nearly as fun, I mean, sure, it's playful, but from a driving dynamic proficiency perspective, I was very much disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
I know the CS drives a lot better.
Yeah, and that car was not on my list, but it probably an honorable mention for me because I drove a base M2 a number of years back, compared it against a 1M, and it was not even close. The steering was light and numb. The engine lacked character. Everything just felt a little bit detached compared to the older 1M. And then more recently, the one that you and I both drove, again, a bone stock one. I felt the same way. The engine, the N55, it's just inferior to the B58 in every way. Also inferior to the S55 in the M2 competition. I think at the price point of that car is reflective of the driving dynamic compared to something like an M2 competition or a 1M, because you can pick those up for $35,000 to $40,000, and I think it feels like a $10,000 to $20,000 worse driving experience compared to an M2 competition.
Yeah. All right, your choice.
All right, so my first one was the Rossion Q1, aka Noble M400. It's the Americanized version of the M400. Basically, when Noble sold the rights to that to produce that car to the American company Rossion, they took it, they made a few tweaks to it, improved it in certain ways, but same engine, Ford Duratec V6 turbocharged, mid-engine, super lightweight, like 2,500 pounds or so, 400 to 500 horsepower, manual transmission. I drove it on track. Only did a few laps, but those few laps were enough to convince me that it is, not everything that I had hoped it would be. The steering was completely dead. And I mean, like, it literally felt like you were driving like a sim racing car with the steering feedback put to 0.
So you've never tried my sim racing rig, because my sim racing rig, you're like, oh my God, I wish real cars had feedback this good.
Right. But imagine turning the feedback to 0. Like even with the tires loaded up, there was nothing. There was no weight, no feedback. And I just could not tell what the car was doing. And the engine was running out of breath above like 5,500 RPM. It was just a very strange driving experience. You go next.
2000 Honda Prelude. So I've driven 2 Preludes. I think this one was 5th generation, and the other one I drove was 4th generation. So
the SH, was it the SH or base?
The 4th one was SH. This one was not SH.
Okay.
The car looks great. I remember when I was younger in the 90s, I thought these were so cool. Even though they're front engine, they look like they're not. Long hood, and I guess they're like, it has character, but it drove worse than the prior gen Prelude that I had driven.
There's a 4-speed auto, right?
It was automatic, and the automatic transmissions also apparently grenade themselves. So, I mean, older automatic transmissions on a lot of cars just kind of suck. So maybe if it was manual, it would have been better. But even still, like, just the chassis dynamics, the steering, it just wasn't that. It was disappointing.
Second one for me, most disappointing, the brand new Mustang GT. The one I drove did not have the premium package, so it had cloth interior. But performance-wise, same as and even a fully loaded Mustang GT. And there was one thing that stood out to me that I really disliked. There were some things that were mediocre, like the manual transmission. It's the Getrag unit instead of the Tremec that you get in like the Shelby cars of old. Kind of sloppy, high effort, not very precise. But the main thing that killed it for me is the steering. Completely, I wouldn't say completely, but compared to like an SS1LE Camaro, the front end is completely dead, lifeless.
The Camaro's front end is great though, right?
Yeah,
that's a pretty high benchmark.
It is a high benchmark, but comparing $50,000 track focused muscle cars, what else can you compare it against? I mean, if that's the benchmark, this fell way short. And even if everything else was a perfect 10 out of 10, I could not recommend that car based on the steering alone. Because if you're going to track a car, you need to have confidence in the front end, and that car just doesn't give it to you. All right, your last pick.
I only had 2.
Oh, okay. Then I'll go again. RCF Track Edition. And I know you have a slightly different opinion because we both drove it at Road America. Granted, it was I think it was actually the first car I drove at Road America that day. So completely new track to me, new car. I was a little bit nervous, to be fair, but I actually drove that car twice at Road America. Even the second time, I was like, how is this a $100,000 car? And why is track edition in its name? Felt too heavy, way too soft in the corners. Transmission was okay. Like once it's warmed up, it shifts okay. But for $100,000, why wouldn't you just get like a GTS 4.0 or a GT4? It way better car on track. RCF, keep it as a street car. Just get a base model, great street car. But the track edition doesn't do nearly enough, even with the carbon ceramic brakes, the wing, like all that stuff. It just feels like a scam.
I drove a regular RCF on the streets, and that's actually one of the first car reviews I ever did on the channel. So pardon the video quality on that. I think it's like way overexposed, but I remember thinking that this is in no man's land where it's not soft and comfortable enough, and it's also not hardcore and sporty enough. It's like make up your mind. The RCF Track Edition, I went in thinking that, okay, this is going to be the same hunk of junk, but I was pleasantly surprised. So I think a lot of it also depends on expectations. I wasn't looking at it as a $100,000 car though. So at the price point, if it was my money, no, I wouldn't get RCF Track Edition. But I was pleasantly surprised that on track, it felt more dynamic. It felt more alive. The engine I loved, as everyone does. And I didn't have any issues with the transmission. Maybe because I drove it later, it wasn't cold because we were only doing half laps or three-quarter laps. So I was getting into the car later in the day where I probably knew the track a little bit better. If you're doing it earlier on, it's cold. Maybe that could also influence.
The second session I drove it, the transmission was better. But again, $100,000, you're comparing it to the PDKs of the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think the emotionality of that car is still higher than a GT. Like, not the engine note, but the playful nature of an FR, like the RCF, versus getting a Cayman, which is going to be super neutral. So I can see someone choosing this car.
That's fair. I would submit that you drive an E46 M3 one day, like a really nice one, and tell me that at $30,000, that's not twice the car of the RCF Track Edition.
All right, man. I mean, I'm looking to get a S2000 or possibly an E46 M3. We'll see.
Next time you're in the Bay, I'll try to set you up with the one that I drove.
I appreciate that. All right, best looking?
Best looking. You go first.
Amira. I mean, that thing is just sex on wheels. Need I say more? We can keep this section a little bit shorter, I think.
Let's keep it short. Let's keep it short. Just keep going. Go through your whole thing.
RX-7 FD, classic, best looking JDM 90s car, hands down. I think other cars look great. I think the NSX, phenomenal looking vehicle, but this is just timeless beauty. And the 458 Italia, it's peak mid-engine Ferrari in my mind. I think part of that is also based on your age, right? Because people who are older or younger, it's kind of like based on your formative experiences, what you're going to like in terms of aesthetics. But I think that's just a classic car. It's always going to look good. It's not overstyled. It's not boring. Beauty.
I agree with you. My top number one choice was 458 Italia as well. In addition to what you said, which I completely agree with. In terms of like formative experiences, I remember, when I was in like late high school, college, I forget when the car came out, like 2009 or 2010. I was in college. I remember that car came out, and keep in mind, the prior generation was an F430, right? And then the 360 before that. Absolute, like they're beautiful cars, but they look like absolute shit boxes compared to the 458. When the 458 came out, it's like you have the sleek sculpted lines, the wide haunches, the 20-inch wheels, the low, like everything about that was just
it looks next level. I had that same poster, that yellow 360 you have in the back. I had the same poster I picked up from elementary school at the book fair. And the 360 I never thought looked amazing. I thought the 430 looked good though. It's obviously not to the same level of 458, but I thought the 430 it looked sporty, it looked classy.
Great, but next to the 458, it looks like a kit car.
Agreed. Yeah.
So second for me, and again, no specific order, 1974 Porsche 911 RSR Tribute. It's a project car built by a guy who's incredibly meticulous. Not to say anything about the way it drove, because it drove great as well, but I've never been a huge fan of the air-cooled 911s in terms of driving dynamics. But in terms of looks, it had the Fuchs wheels, it had the duckbill, just a fantastic looking car and a classic. And then number 3 is the Jays Racing Honda S2000. This is just my inner JDM,
Rice boy.
fanboy talking here, Rice boy talking. Growing up watching Best Motoring, Hot Version, all the Toge battles, the Jays Racing S2000 was like the Toge monster at the time. It was unbeatable. It only got beat like by 0.00 something seconds by the FD RX-7 from RE Amemiya. It just was ingrained in my head as the best looking body kit for the S2000. And, this was a legitimate kit that the person, imported from Japan and had installed on his car. So absolutely fantastic looking car.
I saw it in person. I didn't drive it. It was like the day before or the week before that we saw it in that parking garage.
Yeah.
I thought it looked fantastic. But again, also I'm not as much of a Rice boy as you, but I got some Rice boy in me too.
It's an S2000 that's turned into a Gundam.
A lot of people who are our age, born around 1990 roughly, they're going to love, golden age of the Japanese sports car was the 90s, right? So you grew up with that stuff. It holds a special place in all of our hearts, I think.
For sure.
Most hilarious?
All right. Most hilarious. Go for it.
Aerial Atom 4, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Just nutty. And you guys really need to watch the review videos. I had so many commenters saying that they were nervous while watching the video. Like,
especially in POV. I should have done POV for that video. It's just so crazy.
Yeah, and then also with the binaural audio, you can actually hear the intake on one side, and it feels like you're really there. I was really pleased with how it came in POV, but nutty. And then the Elise Series 2, the owner modified a few things from the first time I drove it to the second time, including, I think the biggest notable change was getting wider section with tires in the front, so it wasn't as understeer prone. And oh my God, those cars are just so light, tossable, less than 2,000 pounds. And that and the Aerial Atom 4, no question.
That's fair. Atom 4 as well for me, for all the reasons that you mentioned. Just, it's everything turned up to 12. The sound, the power delivery, the steering feel, the transmission, the fact that you're sitting in, a bunch of steel tubes just connected together. Like, it just feels like you could die at any moment. And that's what I love.
And that's part of the fun.
That's part of the thrill. Number 2 for me, Ford F-150 Raptor R. Absolute hoonmobile.
Very unexpected.
It's a $111,000 MSRP truck with the 700 horsepower V8 supercharged engine from a GT500 Mustang.
Insane.
And it's a burnout machine because the tires are like these off-road all-terrain tires, zero grip on a flat surface. I took it to the canyons. Big mistake. There's a normal person in a CX-5 behind me, and I could not get away from it in my 700 horsepower car. I love the hell out of that thing. And then number 3 for me is the BMW X6M Competition. So I went into that because I had the Raptor R like right before that. So X6M Competition, super heavy SUV, high center of gravity, massive wheels and tires. I kind of had a feeling it would be almost as underwhelming in the canyons, like a terrible car in the canyons. But then I drove it and I was like, holy cow. Like, say nothing about the styling, which I think is absolutely horrendous from the rear end and the side profile, but that thing drives like in a proper M car on stilts. Like the precision of the steering, the engine response, the flat torque curve. It feels like a V8 B58, if that makes sense. And then combined with that ZF 8-speed auto and the brakes and the suspension, that thing was actually amazing in the canyons, but I would never buy one. $146,000.
That I think is insanely ugly. Just the rear.
It is horrendous.
Insanely ugly.
All right, last category, last but not least, most likely to buy with your own money.
So mine's gonna be kind of boring.
Let's do back and forth on this one. So you do your first one.
Well, these are the cars that I am buying. So the
That's
Lotus
fair.
Mira. Okay.
Okay.
There's a lot I love about it. The styling, double wishbone, all 4 corners, the supercharged V6, the manual transmission. I remember the first one I drove in December of 2022. I thought the transmission was amazing. I was like, holy crap, this is incredible. And then I drove another manual. One of I think the Touring was manual, maybe the Sport was manual, I forget. One of them was auto, one of them was manual. And at that time I was like, this manual is nothing special. So I think that it might be quality control for Lotus. new
That's my
vehicle.
problem with Lotus manuals. It's so inconsistent. I jump from one car to another and I rate it like a 5 for a manual versus like an 8.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm still really excited about the car. It's gonna be a very different experience from any other ownership experience because I've always driven. I've had 2 cars, man, like 2 proper cars,
Yeah,
an FRS and a GR86. All right, like
yeah.
those are the 2 cars. You're not counting the old Camry my mom had that she lent me. So that and a CX-50, right? So going to be a very different experience. I think the amount of attention the car is going to get might be a bit much for me. We'll see.
You'll get used to it. I think, yeah. I think it'll be a great car for you though.
Based on my preferences, steering, manual transmission, styling.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, your turn.
Sweet. All right. This is also kind of a cop-out answer in the same way that yours is, but Civic Type R. And I know, okay, I want to get into this. Let's spend a few minutes on this because I think this is a worthy topic. I know that you have a fairly different, maybe even opposing opinion of the Civic Type R / Integra Type S. They're essentially the same car compared to me. And I want to get into this a little bit. So I know that in your opinion, based on some of the videos that you've done, it's the one thing that stuck out to me that you mentioned a lot is you feel that the torque steer really corrupts the driving experience. And that's, you know, common for many higher powered front wheel drive cars. And here's where I agree, but also would offer that torque steer is only a problem, in my opinion, if it veers you off your intended path. I think if you have a front wheel drive car that has good steering feel, but still torque steers, but the torque steer is not terminal torque steer. Like for example, many years ago, I drove a Mazda Speed 3 and I had to hold the steering wheel as hard as I could to avoid the car literally wrenching the wheel out of my hands and plowing off the side of a road. That's very different than what the Civic Type R and Integra Type S do in terms of torque steer, because you feel that tug at the wheel, but you can very easily adjust the line still with the steering, even if you maintain throttle. Like I've driven on track a number of times. And so in that sense, I think the torque steer piece is largely mitigated for me because the car still has a very precise front end and it's adjustable even when you start to feel that tug at the wheel. So
this is why it's so important that when people are listening to reviewers, they understand the biases. And my bias, like we talked about this before, you're super sensitive to throttle response, right? I'm super sensitive to steering. So if I am not getting steering that is clean and pure and precise and yada, 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 it has a bigger detriment on my overall experience and pleasure driving the vehicle than the average person. And I say that in my videos, hey guys, I'm biased. This is my bias. I think more reviewers need to say that up front. Same thing for me is like the engine or sound of a car is important, but not nearly as important as handling to me. That's again, FRS GR86. So I think that the Civic and the Integra, the steering is one thing that I have an issue with, which that's a good point. Yeah, the torque steer is vastly improved over other front wheel drive vehicles that came before it, but it's still there. And the thing that annoys me to no end is when car reviewers say, oh, there's no torque steer, they completely engineered it out. I'm like, dude, no, you have no idea what you're talking about, and you're literally just parroting what they said in the—
it's literally looking at the marketing
in the engineering. Yeah, you're looking at the marketing stuff and the engineering brief, whatever. Oh, we did this dual axis McPherson strut, and therefore, and if a car reviewer says that, I'm like, cool, I'm never listening to you again because you have no idea what you're talking about. It's just like, it's that blatant to me. Is that offensive to me? The manual transmission is great, but it's a little bit too easy going into gate, too light. It's a great transmission, but I like something that's a little bit more mechanical, a little bit more notchy. The driving position, the interior, the inputs are good, but I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, but like, it just, on my preferences and the way that I enjoy cars, I think the way people talk about it, maybe it's the expectation effect. People talk about it up here. I think it's over here.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think if you're given your preference, like you said, for extreme steering clarity, and again, the reason you got a Lotus Emira,
and the
same reason that you think the GR86 is less enjoyable because of the steering compared to like the FRS.
Oh yeah, FRS in this.
A lot of people are
better.
like, man, the GR86 has great steering, and I'm kind of in the middle camp where I think it has good steering, but it's not as good as the FRS, and it's certainly not class-leading steering. So
yeah, the FRS in hindsight, after driving more cars, I'm like, dude, it's kind of crazy how good they made that steering. At that
it has more weight. It has less slop. Yeah, I would agree with you.
No weird on-center inconsistency either.
Yeah. Yep. All right.
All right. Next one for me is so I drove a CX90 earlier this month, and I watched some reviews. I respect the Savage Geese guys a lot. I think they know what they're talking about. They know their stuff, and they were saying, hey, the CX90 is just Mazda Zoom Zoom in a 3-row SUV doesn't work.
Too stiff.
Weighs 5,000 pounds, and you don't want something that's stiff and sporty. You want something that's just a comfortable cruiser. And they might be right that for the average person, right? I think what Mazda is doing is phenomenal for the driving enthusiast, because if you are a driving enthusiast and you get into a CX-90, you're like, damn, I didn't realize that a 3-row SUV could be this fun, could drive this well, could be this dynamic. The one issue I have with the driving dynamics is that the steering ratio is way too slow. And they talk about how they wanted it slower so they could have, the driver could have mid-corner adjustments without it being twitchy. I think they way overshot that.
They took it too far. Yep.
I think it's just way too slow steering. It's not congruent. I actually have congruence as a factor in my JCDI. I did not rate the CX-90 because I didn't do a Canyon drive the 3-row SUV.
I did, by the way.
I love that. Yeah, if I drove it on the Canyons, I probably would have. But drives beautifully, except the steering is too slow. And there's like some quirks with like the engine transmission and great engine, not as smooth as BMW 6-cylinders. Nice transmission, but it has like these weird things when you're going slow speed. Like,
yeah,
it seems like they need to refine it a little bit more. But I love the like Lexus is a bit, for whatever reason, it doesn't feel as like distinctly Japanese to me as Mazda. The way that they style the interiors, as an example.
Okay.
And Mazda interior is like distinctly Japanese styling on the interior in a very classy way. And that CX-90, I love the interior, dude. I think it is so good. The way that it's styled, and, you know, the touch points aren't up to the same level as some of the German competitors, but it's a lot cheaper than them. So when the CX-70, which I think was rumored to be announced this year, but is now rumored to be announced next year, if and when that comes out in the US, that'll probably be my next vehicle. If it is slotted between the CX-50 and the CX-90 in the ways that I hope it is, same drivetrain as the CX-90, higher towing capacity to take a car to the track. Because I love my CX-50 right now. I think for $42,000 for the top trim, it's a great deal. And the CX-70, I'm sure I'll feel similarly about.
Yeah, just to add a little bit on that, I agree with you. I think the CX-90 is phenomenal. I had one for a week, and it just was fantastic in so many ways. I agree with you. For Canyon driving, the steering ratio is way too slow. I was literally like going hand over hand.
Not even Canyon driving, dude. Even I was just
regular driving
going
too.
around in neighborhoods. You need to take sharp 90-degree turns, and you know I like to take the turn properly, not be one of those idiots that cuts the corner. Like if you're turning left and there's a stop sign here, don't cut it. Like a car might come, you know, and you can't see them yet. So I'm trying to take the turn wide properly, you know, late apex, if you will. And even then, I remember once or twice I got caught off guard. I was like, "Oh crap! I gotta like turn more." You know, I'm gonna hit the curb otherwise. It's really slow.
I think the way I would sum up the CX-90 to me is I love the intent that Mazda put into it. I think they just took some things a little bit too far. I agree the suspension is a little bit too firm. I don't quite agree with Mark and Jack from whatchamacallit, Savage Geese. I think it's not too stiff. Okay. The average person who hops in that car is not gonna be like, wow, this car is uncomfortable. It feels like a sports car. No, absolutely not. It rides well enough. But would I appreciate a little bit more compliance? Yes. Would I appreciate a little bit quicker steering? Yes. Like somewhere in the average between what BMW does nowadays with their EPS racks compared to what they did with the CX-9. Something right in between would be perfect.
One thing that surprised me was with these modern cars, they have TPMS sensors that will give you an actual readout, right? My CX-50, I think, got down because of the, you know, just air leaks over time. And it got down to maybe like 30 PSI, got the alert, and I needed to go fill it up. I went back up to the recommended 35 PSI. And the stiffness between 30 to 35 PSI just driving around the street was massive. So, maybe you take your CX-90, you just let out 2 psi from each wheel, you're like, perfection.
That's a good pro tip there. All right, so my second choice for most likely to buy, the F87 generation BMW M2 Competition. It's a car that I very nearly did buy before I had the opportunity to get the Type S. And reason being, it's front engine rear wheel drive, good power, lots of top end thrust from the S55 engine. You can get it with a manual transmission.
Great word choice.
Chill out, dude. It has a reasonably usable back seat. It's something that's daily drivable. Cons for me would be, obviously BMW maintenance costs, the fact that there is no, Android Auto. I think in those cars, it only had Apple CarPlay. I know that's a peasant problem. And the price, $55,000 on average, I just couldn't quite. It's not that I couldn't justify it. I just felt that if I'm going to spend that much money on a car, especially a German car, I would want it to be brand new with a new car warranty. Yeah.
So is the comp that much better than the regular?
Oh my God, dude. Oh, okay. I should caveat that the only comp I drove was modified with KWV3 suspension. So it's kind of hard to say, like from a suspension standpoint, base versus comp. But the difference in engine characteristic between the two is massive. Like the N55 in the base, it just kind of pulls and pulls, and then it doesn't ever pull harder. The harder you push it, the harder you rev it out. The S55 gives you a much more metallic sound, and it revs out higher, like 7,600 RPM rev line for a turbo engine. It's phenomenal.
How about the steering and the transmission?
I remember the steering feeling a little bit better as well. I think the base was definitely underwhelming. The comp isn't going to blow you away with steering. If you're a steering snob, it's not going to be super impressive. Yeah. But overall, the handling was better. It felt more stable. I don't know how much of that was because of the KWV3, but it's a car I could see myself owning.
Oops.
Oh.
That's my
some mood lighting there.
Let me fix that. Let's go back. There we go.
All right. What's your third pick?
This one's also kind of like, I'm going to be selling my GR86. I need to just take photos and list it. And then I'm leaning towards just replacing with an S2000. Other cars that I would consider in this place would be Lotus Elise, but then I don't want two mid-engine rear-wheel drive cars, even if they do drive very different.
Yeah.
And then you're mentioning the E46 M3, so maybe I need to take a look at that. But it wasn't this year that we drove it, but it was end of last year that we drove Eric's S2000. And that to me, like, if I could just buy that car as is, that's the dream situation. That car is so good, man. It's like, if you look at the top of my JCDI, it's the Porsche, Ariel Atom Ferrari, Porsche, S2000, Porsche, NSX. Yeah. It's like, it's so good. It's really up there. So I've never owned an S2000. I want something that's a little bit more hardcore. The GR86, I think, is a fantastic vehicle if you want it as your only vehicle. If you're a young person, you want something that's relatively practical, far more practical than a Miata. I was able to live with my FRS for 9 years. I did not feel like it was a big nuisance. I'm not taking 3 friends with me in the car, but guess what? My other friends have cars, so when we need to do that, that's fine. And if not, driving with a girlfriend, no issue. Even moving between apartments, no furniture, obviously. I was able to fit all my belongings in there. So now I guess what I'm trying to do is find a vehicle that is more hardcore, more punishing, worse of a daily driver. Because nowadays, dude, I was driving my CX-50 almost every day. I rarely touch my GR86, and that's when I realized I needed to sell it. Because I still think it's a fantastic car, but maybe doing these car reviews has been like, it's kind of spoiled me. I'm like, dude, I want something that's feels more like an occasion when I get behind the wheel. That Lotus Elise feels like an occasion. Eric's S2000 feels like an occasion. And you want to be a little bit beat up after you go for a spirited drive or go to the track. You don't want it to be super refined. You don't want it to be super easy to drive if you have that 2-car garage or 3-car garage.
And I think part of that, just something for your consideration, is modifications. Like if you were to take a stock S2000, which I think you've done on track, it's not going to feel like that
it
much.
It still feels way more emotional because Jimmy's, he had stock AP1, AP2. I did a comparison over a year ago, And even those cars were like far more emotional, far more special feeling than totally stock.
Even for given the affinity towards steering feel that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I did prefer the AP1 because of the steering, but yeah, Eric's S2000, the way he modified it, the steering was, yeah, I didn't even realize S2000s could have that good of steering. And he was explaining to me it's because of the caster and yada yada yada. But even with the steering, I mean, the AP1 stock to me was very engaging to drive, much more so than the AP2. Part of that is the steering ratio, but also just a sharper vehicle to drive at the limit.
Yeah, I agree with that. Something you'll need to drive at some point is a S2000 Club Racer, because that's an AP2 with an AP1 steering ratio.
Yeah, that'd be awesome to drive. Those are quite rare.
They are quite rare and quite overpriced now. Number 3 pick for me, and this is kind of a controversial one for myself, Cadillac CT4V Blackwing, because I sort of considered getting that car, but when I drove it, after I got my Integra Type S, I actually came away a bit disappointed. And despite being disappointed with it for various reasons, just watch the video if you want to know all the reasons why. But it's a car I want to give a second chance because the reviews on it were so good that I feel like maybe in the 20 minutes, 25 minutes that I drove it, maybe I missed something. Maybe it wasn't doing something justice, because everyone's like, oh man, like this is the car you want. Like this is manual rear wheel drive. It can, haul a family of 5. It's dynamically better than yada yada BMW, Mercedes, Audi, whatever. It's track capable. It's the perfect all-in-one car that you can have a lot of fun with and have front engine rear wheel drive dynamics. When I drove it, it was good, but it wasn't great. And so that's something that I want to give a second chance.
In that kind of vehicle where it's going to be dual duty, it's going to be the car you're driving most days, your daily driver, but also you're taking to the track because you're not getting rid of your NSX. So this is kind of your do it all. For me, interior for a vehicle of that purpose becomes very important. And I haven't been in a CT4 Blackwing, but from the videos and the photos I've seen, I feel like I wouldn't love the interior and that would bother me enough where I'd probably choose something else, BMW or something else instead.
That part is definitely underwhelming.
Yeah, the IS500 has an older interior, but it's still feels nice and classy and great build quality, build materials.
Agreed.
Okay. So 2 other things I wanted to briefly mention. One is that I think one thing that you see a lot of is just cynicism amongst car enthusiasts about how cars are getting worse and boo-hoo, this sucks. And I feel like it's so misplaced and misguided. And there's a reason why a lot of people, and not just car enthusiasts, but just in various niches, turn to cynicism. It's because by being cynical, you avoid looking naive. Oh, of course, you thought things were going to be better. How silly of you, how naive. And it's easier to just, it's like a negativity bias that humans have. But it gets so old and it's so irritating and so just it's toxic for the person saying it and to the people that they're spreading it to. I think we have so much to be grateful for in this day and age. Cars, I think, overall, on average, are getting better and better. Are there things that we are losing? Yeah, that's why I'm looking at getting a possible S2000. But I have optionality, and I can get a Lotus Emira, brand new car that I really want, and also an S2000. And there's pros and cons of each. Like some things are getting better, some things are getting worse. Cars are way more powerful, way more safe, way more comfortable. There's so many things to be grateful for. And it's okay to not have a strong opinion one way or another. You don't have to be super polarized. You don't have to love something or hate something. You can be like me, where I'm like, yeah, the Civic Type R, I think is very capable for what it is. I respect it. I think it's a cool car. I don't love it. I don't hate it. You don't have to have a strong opinion one way or another on every little thing. And even like Lotus versus Porsche, I was doing a video with someone, not car related, and he also turns out to be a car guy. And strong opinion one way or another versus just the brand of like, oh, I know between Porsche and Lotus, I know what I would choose. And it's okay to just walk the middle line and appreciate the nuance, the pros and cons, the little things that you like here and there about modern cars versus old cars versus even driving a Mazda CX-90. I found a lot of things I'm so grateful for about modern vehicles, about modern Mazdas.
Yeah.
Right?
I think I completely agree with you. And one thing I would add to that is this is a hypothesis, but I think a lot of that negativity comes from a place of total ignorance. I feel a lot of people who comment things like, oh, completely writing off one brand or saying another brand is the best thing since sliced bread, or like saying like everything built in 2005 and up is a piece of shit. Like those types of comments, frankly, I think largely come from people who have never truly experienced the breadth and variety of cars that they should have in order to make an intelligent comment about whatever they're saying. One example of this, and this is a biased, like a self-biased example, but just one that comes to mind is because I've made so many videos of my Integra Type S, one comment that I see all the time, which I think is terribly misplaced, is that the Integra Type S is just an overpriced Civic, and it feels like a $25,000, $30,000 car. Like, I think that's incredibly misplaced because, like, frankly, most people have never sat in Integra Type S. They haven't made that many of them yet. They're not that many out in the wild. They're not that easy to get into. And so how can you judge a book by its cover when you've never sat in that book?
Yeah, a lot of people, part of it's confirmation bias too. You kind of have a belief. You just want to find, oh, this one reviewer said it though, therefore I agree, and that's more evidence in my favor. And sometimes people just want to believe the thing that makes them feel better too. I have this old car. I can't buy a new one. Therefore, I want to say that this car that I have, this first gen FRS is way better than the second gen because I can get a second gen, and the first gen is, it's way better. Yeah. It's just the way that humans are.
For sure.
The last thing is that we're getting old, man. I'm 33. You're
God, don't remind
you're
me.
also 33 soon.
I'm 6 days away.
Yeah, you're almost 33 too. And fitness is becoming more and more important. And based on the goals I have in terms of fitness and longevity, I talk a lot about that on my personal channel, Kevin Jubbal MD, but I'm cycling a lot more. And like this week I did 8 hours, about 120 miles on the bike. And if you like driving, then I think cycling has some similarities. Different bikes ride differently, different chassis. Well, it's a bike frame, but the materials, the way that the carbon is weaved, the wheels, the tires,
the brake pads.
It's more about whether it's rim brakes or disc brakes, but yeah, I guess you do argue brake pads. Modulating like the actual how linear the gravity, like there's a lot of these little different things, and I think that someone who enjoys driving might also enjoy cycling. It's a healthy way to also indulge in that need for speed, that being out on a canyon road, bombing the hills, and just wanted to share it with the viewers because it's something that pleasantly surprised me this year.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I have a number of friends who are into cars and also love cycling, so I'm not surprised. There seem to be some commonalities between the two in terms of like if you enjoy something in a car, you might also enjoy it in a bike. Probably something I should look into as well. Yeah,
that was just a little part of my year-end reflection. I figured this is end of December, so might as well add that one in.
Fantastic. All right, I think we're well over an hour at this point. So just want to say, I think this has been a fantastic year. 2023 was I think a big year for me personally, as a car reviewer, first and foremost, just because I've driven a much greater breadth and depth of cars than previous years. And I think a lot of that is because I've spent a lot more time and effort and just like intentionality on the YouTube channel. I think last year was the first year where I really took it kind of seriously, started reaching out to press, companies to get access to press cars, started driving a lot more, expensive cars as well. And I think I'm finally in a place where I can consistently put out frequently put out a consistent level of quality and content. Whereas in prior years, I really struggled with that because, I would go on, a filming binge and film like 5 videos in one weekend and then just like not film anything for a couple of years or for a couple of months. And so I think definitely it was a good year for me. I think for you as well, We filmed a lot of the same cars this year, so it's been really interesting. And also, I'm just very thankful that we get to drive the same cars in the same day in the same conditions and talk about it afterwards and like reflect on what we thought of each car, like, and based on, like you said, our personal preferences and biases for certain things, that really shows in the way that we review certain cars. So I'm always really curious, like after we drive the same car, how are you going to rate it in JCDI versus how am I going to rate it in ZPI? A lot of the times it's more close than not, but the things that are different are the things that really make me think about stuff more. And I think having that ability to like ping off of each other and like ping back and forth has helped me grow as a car reviewer, because now I'm more, I guess, nuanced when I think about, oh, steering feel, what does that mean? Oh, torque steer, how does that affect the way that I can push a car? And I think it's just really, really fun, really, really cool. Very thankful that we get to do that. And also, you know, now that you're growing into a car reviewer and getting access to certain cars, like you got to drive the GR Corolla Morizo, which is super awesome. You know, I haven't had the opportunity to do that yet. Would love to someday. You got to drive the R8 V10. That's badass as well. I know we have a couple of trips coming up in the early part of 2024. Raleigh, North Carolina. We're going to drive a huge variety of cars, including a lot of older M cars, BMWs and such. And then we have a potential trip coming up in Japan as well in April. We're going to rent some stuff probably from Omo Shiro Rent-A-Car, which I've done once. Fantastic experience. We can experience all the JDM legends. Like it's going to be a good year. I think this year was definitely my favorite year of being a car reviewer. And next year is shaping up to be an even better one. So super, super thankful for the viewers first and foremost. You know, the support has been great. I've seen a lot of growth with my channel this year. I think 2 weeks ago, or maybe 3 weeks ago, I hit 40,000 subscribers. Hey, look, to me, that's a big deal because this is something that is not my full-time job. It is something I do purely, you know, I started purely as a hobby. And now that I get to lean into it a little bit more outside of my day job, this is what gives me joy. My full-time job pays the bills, but I spend the bills and the time and the effort and energy on this stuff because this is what I truly enjoy.
Yeah, man, 40K on a car review channel this day and age, I think is definitely impressive. I mean, I'm not even at 10K. So after doing this for almost 2 years. So I think that's fantastic. You should be very proud of that. And yeah, man, super grateful. I don't want to have my whole spiel. I'll probably save that for off camera. But yeah, really grateful. You've helped connect me with a lot of viewers, and this year, big for me getting press car access for the first time, and also attending press events. So it's been a great year. Looking forward to 2024. Thanks for having me on, and much love to all the viewers.
Hell yes. And just to one last time to all the viewers, thank you guys so much. Merry Christmas, happy holidays. 2023 was a great year, and 2024 is shaping up to be an even better one. All right, guys, take care. Thanks, Kevin.
I don't know what the hell is
that.
I don't know why the balloons went up.